Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are sitting down with repeat guest and a friend of the show, Thomas Oord, to talk about a brand new book that he wrote with Tripp Fuller called God After Deconstruction. And Tom, welcome back to the show. It's always good to connect.
Oh, I love our conversations, Glenn.
Me too. So, how did you and Tripp come to write this book? Where did this idea come from? Because I feel like there's got to be, maybe there's a story behind it. I don't really know, but if there is, I want to hear it. Where'd this book come from?
Well, really, we were talking initially about um, open relational theology and how um, the people who tend to know open and relational thought and write books about it often write a little too academic in their prose, and
Hmm.
the average person doesn't really, you know, grasp it. And
Yep.
so we thought, well, what can we do to write something that a wide array of people would understand it?
Hmm.
And then, of course, Tripp and I have been through our own deconstructions, and we have lots of friends who are either in the midst of or have gone through deconstruction. And we found that so many of those people know what they're against.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like they know all the bad ideas they can no longer hold. They know how the church has hurt them and others, etc. So they know what they're against, but they don't really have a framework of what they're for.
Hmm.
At least they can't articulate it very well.
Yep.
And we think open and relational theology provides that kind of framework, the framework that matches our deep intuitions, our moral thought, our moral assumptions, etc. So that's kind of the background of this book.
Yeah, I feel like, especially when I first started my deconstruction journey, it was easy to get stuck in that mindset of what you're against, because I always felt like I was on the defense,
Right.
especially with my former tribe and stuff. Like I felt like I didn't have felt like there wasn't enough mental space to really figure out what I thought because I had so many people attacking me
Yep.
about what I was now against. So I was just constantly trying to find answers to those things. And then it was like a year or so into it. I'm like, man, I've done so much back and forth with people. I really need to sit down and think about like what is it, that I'm going to move forward with in my faith journey, because now I know what I'm leaving behind. What does it look like now that I'm going to
Yes.
step forward?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's natural to be in that place
Yeah,
because my background's similar to yours. We only knew what we knew,
that's
right?
right. That's right.
And plus, I'm guessing you're like me in that the people in my background warned me against, going too liberal. Or, in
Yep.
those days we didn't use the word progressive very often. It was mostly liberal,
Yep.
and so I was like fighting a kind of um, subconscious guilt for
Mhm.
having this attraction to different ideas and not having a framework to put them in. And yeah, it's bad enough to deconstruct, but it's awfully difficult to be in limbo and knowing where you go next.
Yeah, it's a spider web of things because you just think it's your beliefs, but it's so much more than your beliefs because
Yes.
it's a lot of shame. I know for me there was a lot of shame because I felt like part of me felt like I'm becoming the person I've been warned about my whole life, right? And so there
Yes.
was like wrestling with that kind of thing, and then there's also the relational aspect of things. Like you don't realize how many relationships will be affected, and how I think too, like how many you come to realize like how many of those relationships were built not so much on like a mutual maybe love for the other person, but more like an alignment of beliefs. And like as soon as those beliefs
Yeah.
start to break down, the relationship starts to break down. And that's a lot to deal with as well. So I mean there's just so many different angles to deconstruction that is much more than just what I believe about God.
Yeah. Let me say a bit about that relationship
Hmm.
stuff because that's the stuff that surprised me the most. I'm a fairly intellectual person. I've always kind of been interested in ideas and read books and that sort of thing. But even at this, I'm in my 50s now, even at this place in my life, the relational elements are still a big issue for me. Just a couple weeks ago, I went to my hometown church where I was, born and raised. And this older gentleman who was, one of my Sunday school teachers came up to me afterwards and started talking about a book that I'd written. And I felt really weird because he didn't understand the book and he thought it said something that it didn't say. And then simultaneously, one of his sons, who's closer to my age, starts
Mhm.
sending me private social media messages, and he did understand the book, and he loves it. And
Mm,
so now I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be once his father figures out what's really going on here, I'm
yeah,
gonna be in a weird situation, a father son who have different ideas on God.
yeah,
Yeah, weird
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. What I love too about the book, I mean, just starting with like the title, God After Deconstruction, I think in my experience, and maybe this has been your experience too, especially with my former tribe and people who, associate with evangelicalism, more often than not, when I tell them about my deconstruction or I share about my rethinking of God or the Bible, whatever, the assumption, like 9 times out of 10 is that like I've left God, right?
Right.
Like I've left Jesus, I've left the Bible, I've left my faith altogether. But, I think the title of the book is so important because it shows that that might be the case for some people, and that's
Yeah.
fine. If that's your journey, if that's where your journey takes you, so be it. But that's not necessarily the case for everybody. And like trying to explain to people that like today, I have a deeper appreciation for God, for the story of Jesus, for the Bible that I still read on a regular basis, much
Mhm.
more so than I ever did before. And just because I don't see things regarding those things the way that you do, doesn't mean that I don't appreciate them or still follow them in a different way. So I think that right off the bat, the title is very affirming because it helps people understand that you can still follow God post
Right, right,
deconstruction.
yes. Yeah, and let me give our listeners or viewers or whatever, little statistics to
Hmm.
back up what you just said.
Hmm.
In 2007, Pew Research asked Americans to identify their religious affiliation. 16% of Americans checked the none box, None. I don't have
Hmm.
any religious affiliation. 2023, 16 years later, the same poll goes out, and 28% of Americans check that none box.
Mm,
So if there are 300 plus million people in America, that's more than 30 million people have gone from having a religious affiliation to having no religious affiliation.
that's right.
However, of that 28%, more than 80% still believe in God.
Yeah.
So I suspect that a good portion of that 30 plus million have deconstructed from evangelicalism or conservative Catholicism or whatever.
Yeah.
But they're not necessarily walking away from belief in God.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, but a really freeing, because I was at a point where I was like, I'm just ready to walk away from Christianity altogether because there's so
Yeah.
many things in it that are, have been so, and we'll talk about it more later, I'm sure, but like traumatizing. There's just so much toxic theology, all these different things, from my stream of the faith that I came from, which I was taught is the only stream. This is the way that it is.
Yep.
And then when I started to, deconstruct and started to widen my reading and things like that, I came across Bart Ehrman's book was huge, Lost
Hmm.
Christianities. And that caught my
Mm.
attention because I'm like, what is this plural
Yeah.
Christianities? What does that even mean? So I remember reading that book and my mind was just blown that like in the early centuries, he has this one comment in there where he says the early centuries of Christianity were much more diverse than even it is today with all of our many denominations. I was like, what in the world? And so I started to read more about these other streams, whether they were Gnostic or, whatever they might be. But just the idea that so many people thought so in so many different ways about Jesus and the cross and the Bible, and yet they were
Hmm.
still Christians was just very freeing to me because I felt like, oh, like I don't need to align with this narrow stream anymore. I can still call myself a Christian and I can adopt maybe these different ideas that might fit my journey and my experience. And so that for me was a very freeing moment.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I don't think I ever quite had that exclusivistic a view of my particular sect of Christianity because I'm from the holiness tradition, the Church of
Hmm.
the Nazarene. And we knew early on we were a minority voice amongst other Christians. And, obviously our people thought we had the best thing going and the other
Yeah.
ones, were not as good. But
Hmm.
still, I think I knew early on there were other options on the table. It helped too that my mother was Pentecostal holiness. My father was Dutch Reformed. So
Hmm.
already in the family, we had a little, ecumenicism
A
going
little
on.
bit of this, a little bit of
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
Right. So you have this quote in the book, and I wanted to read it for our listeners. It's from Angela Harrington, and
Mm,
she says, deconstruction isn't a 10-step formula easily passed from one person to another. It's a personal journey shaped by our beliefs, experiences, privilege, and trauma. And that quote and that's this section of the book really grabbed me because I feel like one of the lies or the misunderstandings out there about deconstruction is that it is a formula. Like it is
yeah.
something that everybody goes through the same thing. And you one day wake up and you make this decision that I'm going to deconstruct because, I want to sin and I want to have freedom to go and do all these
Let's face
things.
it, Glenn, you want to sleep around is what it really
That's
comes
all I
down
wanna do, and I
to.
wanna go get drunk and do drugs and do all this different kind of stuff because that's what I wanna do. And, that's like the lie that's out there, and I've heard a lot of people who are very serious about their faith, like, say that kind of thing. But I think that Angela brings up a good point here that there's no 10-step formula.
Right.
There is no there is no path that people just choose that they're gonna deconstruct one day. So what I was hoping to hear is a little bit about your personal journey,
Mm,
of deconstruction, because again, everybody's story is different. And so I think that it's important for people to hear the stories of other people so maybe they can grasp their own story a little bit better. But I would love to hear a little bit about your journey. What led you to deconstruction? What was the ups and downs of it? Was it
mhm.
was it a snap decision, Tom? Was it a process over time? What did it look like for you?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the holiness tradition, the Church
Mhm.
of the Nazarene, and I'm still an ordained elder in that tradition, even though I've had lots of uh, rocky things go on. But
I'm an elder in the Reformed Church, just if you
are you
like.
really? Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't
well,
realize
it's
that.
yeah, mini John Calvin over here.
But I was one of these people as a youngster who went to the altar many times to accept Jesus into my heart,
Mhm,
went to church camp and gave my life to Jesus many times. And by the time I was in college, I was a pretty hardcore evangelist. I was one of these annoying people who would sit next to you on an airplane and bring up Jesus or
yeah,
walk up to you on the beach with the four spiritual laws. I was
mhm,
aggressive evangelist. But I found in doing that that you know people weren't being converted as quickly as I thought they should be. And those who were converted seemed to not have a very good structure, framework to
mhm,
grow as Christians. Um, and then near the end of my college career, I took a course in philosophy of religion. And for the first time, really took seriously
mm,
the writings of agnostics, atheists, people from other religious traditions.
mhm,
And it was for the sake of intellectual honesty that I couldn't decided I couldn't believe in God anymore.
mm,
I don't know if I was an atheist or an agnostic, but whatever I was, it was I didn't have the kind of foundation that I thought I needed to have to believe in God.
mm,
And for me, this was not because the church had hurt me, although the church had hurt me some, but not like other people.
mhm.
It wasn't because I wanted to sleep around. It was intellectual reasons for
Mhm,
not having belief in God. I came back to believe in God primarily for two reasons. One, wanted life to have ultimate meaning, and I didn't think that was possible unless there was an ultimate ground of meaning that most people call God.
mhm,
And the deep intuitions of love that I felt, I thought needed to be grounded in some kind of ultimate lover to really
mm,
make perfect sense.
mhm,
And then I slowly started to build back my theology over time. Took me years.
mm,
And then about, well, let's see, 6 or 7 years later, I went through a second deconstruction, and this was more related to Jacques Derrida and his work on language.
mhm,
What Derrida says is that any of the words we have don't have an absolute meaning, and what they mean always depends on the context, and that includes the biblical words, are words like God and love that are so important to me, at least. And when that threw me for a loop for a while. I was like, ugh, if I don't have this language, these propositions, these statements of faith that I can
mhm,
put my absolute trust and certainty in, what do I have? I eventually came around to thinking that experience was more fundamental than language, even though that's not a foundation. It helped me then to work and think about God in terms of experience, or what
Mm.
some people would call mysticism. Although, still with my evangelical background, I kind of shy away from that word.
Yeah, that was a hard word for me to embrace, but I feel like these days, if I had to really nail down like a label, so to speak, I feel like I would fall into that mystical kind
Mm,
of a category just because I love the word that's associated with it, which is mystery, right? Like I feel
mm,
like there's so much about God and there's so much about, spirituality and faith that back in the day I had my, statements of belief and my things that I could nail
yeah,
down and I could rattle them off, like anybody else could,
yep,
but nowadays I'm like, man, I feel like it just crosses the T's and dots the I's like a little bit too much, and I feel like
yeah,
there's that Rob Bell quote where he says, if we have God all figured out, we're no longer dealing with God anymore, and for the
mm,
longest time, like I felt like I prided myself, so to speak, on having all of those answers because of that verse in the New Testament somewhere. I think it's Peter, where it says, you got to have an answer for every
right,
question that comes your way. That was something I
yeah.
I
Always
would have
be
taken to
prepared to give an
yeah, I would
account
have
of the
taken
hope
that
you
to the
have
grave
within
with
you.
me. Exactly. Like I was always ready. I had the Jack McDowell, evidence that demands a verdict,
Yep.
Wayne Grudem systematic theology. Like I had all those answers. But nowadays I'm like, man, it just feels like so like there's gotta be more to it than that. Like even the Jesus story, like Jesus dying on the cross just to, appease an angry God. Like, is that it? Like, there's got to
Well,
be more to the story than that, And like, what is the more? I don't really know. But what if it's this? And what if it's that? And what if it could be more of this? And like, just letting your mind kind of run with these stories, I feel like it's just been so good for me. So in the mystical tradition, I feel like I'm finding more of a home in that place.
that mystery word is a troubling one for me, and it's troubling because on the one hand, I think mystery always has a role when it comes to God, because I don't
Hmm.
think anyone should claim they've got God figured out. I'm not certain that God exists. If God exists, I'm not certain exactly what God is like. So I think there's plenty of mystery there.
Yeah.
But I'm also I'm wary of the mystery word because, as you probably have the same experience in your background, when I would talk to my more conservative fundamentalist friends and point out the flaws in their thinking,
Hmm.
they would oftentimes quickly go to mystery instead of changing their thinking. They'd
Mm,
say, "Oh, God's ways are not our ways.
mm.
Well, God's infinite. You're finite, Tom. How can you even question evil in the world and that God is
Yeah.
loving?"
Yeah.
And a mystery card got played as an excuse not to rethink their fundamental views of God.
Yeah.
So when it comes to mystery, I want to say yes, we can't know God fully, we can't be certain about God, but I like to put on the table views of God I think could be more plausible than others,
Hmm.
and that's part of what we do in this book.
Yeah. That's a good point. I never really thought of that because you're right. And I mean, I was one of those people who would fall back on the mystery card, that,
Yeah.
well, God's ways are not our ways. And one day when you get to heaven, you'll understand. That was another
Mm,
big one. Was
yep.
why do bad things happen? That's your that's one of your big things that you address in your work. And the answer is always, well, we don't know why it is now, but one day we're gonna see more clearly, and we'll have all the answers. And that was just a nice way to kind of push the bigger question under the rug, but to
Right.
fall back on mystery. So I think I guess you're right. I mean, there could be positives to the mystery side. There could also be negatives to the mystery side. I think it's a matter of, being aware of that and how that fits into your own journey.
Hmm.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the Bible, Tom. You have a
Okay.
chapter in here called Bible Conundrums. Talk to me a little bit about these conundrums because for me, the Bible was a hard thing to
Yeah.
grapple with once I started to deconstruct and I was taught that it's inerrant. I was taught that it's perfect. It's 100% free of errors and inconsistencies. And
Mhm.
we were built in seminary and Bible college to be able to argue about, all those different things. But then I started to like read the Bible, like really read it,
Mhm.
without those rose colored glasses of my youth. And a lot of it, just started to kind of fall apart for me. because I saw that this book, wasn't perfect. It was God was acting quite toxic in a lot of places. The book
Mhm.
itself seems to be toxic in a lot of places. There's a lot of inconsistencies. There's a lot of letters, that are quote forged, if you want to use that word, that I was, told
Mhm.
was not the case. And honestly, I put the Bible away. I've told people a lot about this. I put the Bible away for 6 months, maybe even closer to a year, because like I couldn't read it anymore.
Mhm.
Apart from that fundamentalist perspective that I was given. So maybe talk to us a little bit about what these conundrums are that you guys address in chapter 5. And what does it look like for you, Tom, to wrestle with the Bible over the course of your own spiritual journey? Maybe how has your thinking about it evolved from where you were to where you are with it today?
Yeah. I faced the inerrancy question in college.
Hmm.
I had started taking New Testament Greek, and I started realizing that even if there weren't errors in the text and the English translations, there were at least a variety of possibilities from the oldest manuscripts we had,
Yeah.
and so we couldn't think every jot and tittle was exactly what God wanted, because
Right.
if God had done that once, God apparently didn't do a good job of preserving all that
Right.
because we have so many different manuscripts. But then, then there were things that I started noticing, like different counts, and when people would make a list of who's there, and there'd be alternating accounts, and
Hmm.
or Paul in one point in one of his letters says, "When I was there, I didn't baptize anybody." And then two verses later, he says, "Oh yeah, but I did baptize this one person."
I forgot we did
Yeah. And
that.
then a little bit later, "Oh yeah, there might have been more." And so, like, if you take every single verse as inerrant, that first one must be an error
Right,
if the
that'd be
other
a
ones are
problem.
true.
Right.
Yeah. But even more difficult, and you alluded to this, are the passages, some of which portray God as forgiving, nonviolent, and other passages as portraying God as wanting or even commanding violence and
Mhm.
genocide.
Yep,
That was much harder for me.
yep.
And when I was young and I really wanted to have a perfect Bible that had a perfect picture of God, I would try to rationalize how bashing babies' heads against the rocks, like it says in Psalms, was somehow loving from the divine perspective. And I couldn't do it. At the end of the day, I had to say, look, this seems to be a contradiction. Now, what some of my friends will do, they'll say, well, yeah, it seems to be a contradiction, but again, that's just your finite mind, Tom. If
Mhm.
you had God's eye, you'd see it all fits
The
together.
mystery card again, right?
Right, yeah. And I say to those people, but I don't have the God's eye view, and
Right.
neither do
It
you.
doesn't do me any good.
Yeah. So we got to do the best with what we have. Or sometimes I'll give an analogy. Some people treat the Bible like something you can never question. And I
Mhm.
say, well, imagine if someone came up to you and they were in a religion that said that the truth was hidden under a rock on Mars, and a mouse on Mars wrote the truth.
Mm.
And you said, well, let me see it. And they said, well, you can't, it's on Mars. And they said, well, I would say, well, I don't have access to it. And they would say, well, just trust the mouse on Mars.
Right. It's
No,
trust the mouse.
no one would take that seriously. And yet that's the way a lot of Christians do with a Bible that has errors and contradictions.
Yeah.
So today I still read the Bible.
Mm.
I still look for what I think are overarching themes that are I use in my theologizing. I think those themes revolve around love, but I'm very blunt and forward about verses that I think undermine those themes.
Mhm.
And I'm very blunt to say I think sometimes the biblical writers misunderstood God or got things wrong. And I think that's a better approach than trying to waffle and make excuses when there are inconsistencies.
Yeah, a big moment for me. And I was just talking to somebody about this on the show a couple days ago. I was recording with somebody. I forget who it was, but we were talking about the Bible. We were talking about LGBTQ people,
Mm,
and growing up in my narrow stream, it was all gay people are going to hell because of
mhm,
these 6 verses that we had memorized.
mhm,
And, I carried that with me for the longest time. And then when I left for the church and I went to work for Apple, where I was that for 11 years, the first store I was in was, we had 150 people in the store. And so there's lots of people from many other traditions. And now mine is the I'm a very, very small minority, of people
Yep.
in this store. And I became friends with people who are gay, people who are lesbian, people who are trans. I'm like, man, what I'm experiencing with these people is not at all what I was taught about them.
Mhm.
I remember I
Mm.
went home to my wife and I said, listen, I know these verses that we've been taught. I said, but like I'm meeting these people, I'm becoming friends with these people. I see them, their joys, I see their sadness, their sorrow. I've heard them talk about God and their faith. I've seen some of them reading their Bibles at lunchtime. I said, it's blowing my mind. It's like, I don't know what to
Mm.
do with it. I said, but a big moment for me was when I said, if the Bible says that these people are going to hell, the Bible is wrong. And that was like a
Mm.
big moment
Wow.
for me
Yeah.
because I would have never, ever imagined saying the Bible is wrong in my
Yep.
past. But I was face to face with this experience that was challenging everything I knew intellectually. And I felt like my heart advanced 500 steps forward and my
Yeah.
brain was still way back here, but my heart was saying, "Don't worry, brain. Like you're going to catch up eventually. But this is where we're going, so let's go."
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, but that was a big moment for me with it to be able to say the Bible could be wrong about something. And I think that you bring up a very important point that there are times where we come across stories in the Bible, verses in the Bible, ideas in the Bible that need to be rejected in some way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And
Yeah.
I mean, you bringing up the queer example, that's another chapter in the book in
Mhm.
which we talk about so many people who are deconstructing over this issue. And it's not a surprise that people who are queer are deconstructing over this because they feel ostracized,
Yep.
pushed out, not accepted. But we like to point out that there are a huge number of allies who are also deconstructing over this. People who are straight who are also walking away from church because of the way their friends who are queer are being treated, or their children, or their brothers and sisters, or whoever.
Yep.
And I realized this recently when I was thinking about being in seminary, and we had this one class in which the professor liked to say, "This is why conservative churches grow and liberal churches decline." And then someone will say, "Yeah, but what about all the 20-year-olds who used to be in conservative churches who aren't there anymore?" And this professor would say, "Well, statistics show that once they start having kids, they'll come back to church."
Mm,
And I think this queer issue is an issue on which young parents are not taking their kids back to church because church, in their mind, no longer serves as the moral compass that it once did for previous generations.
mm,
If you're going to a church that's not an affirming church, you don't want your kids to be queer negative,
yeah.
and that's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, our daughter is 7 and she's starting to ask, some different questions about people, and she knows that we have friends who, are gay, and in her mind it's like they feel different because that's not part of what her experience is. And so we've tried to explain to her, like, yeah, we have a friend who, she has a girlfriend and they might be getting married soon, and you might have kids in your class who maybe have two dads or two moms. We're talking to her about even, people who are transgender and transitioning and things like that, and just trying to expand in her mind. And she's also realizing that, there are people who don't think that that's okay. Like, it's not okay to
Yep.
be that way. And so we've said to her, like, we want to make everybody feel safe in this place. We want to make everybody feel welcome in this place and in our home. And she's been asking me lately about, like what I used to do before she was born. And so telling her that I used to be a pastor, and she asked me about all my books and things like that. So telling her about my schooling, and, she said, well, what did you learn about God, when you were in school? I was like, well, my ideas that I was taught about God are much different than they are today. And so talking about, the evolution of my own thoughts and things like that. But going back to saying to her that, there are some people, who, and I used to be one of those people who thought that it was wrong to be gay, who thought that it was wrong for somebody to have two dads or to have two moms, and trying to break it down to her on a level that she can understand. And she's like, "Why in the world would you think that?" You know, she's like challenging. You know, and I'm like, "Because that's just what I that's what I was taught." And I said, "There's a lot of churches out there, where people gather to learn about God, and this is what they're taught, like, in those places, but there's other churches as well that teach things very differently." And so,
Yeah.
just to your point, there are people out there who I think, they don't feel safe to bring their children to churches because they don't want them to get taught that exclusive way, that
Yeah.
they're trying to give them an inclusive mindset at home. They don't want the exclusive mindset to come in from church.
Yeah. As you're talking about your daughter, I'm thinking about my daughters. My daughters are in their 20s and 30s,
Mhm,
and two of them don't go to church anymore.
mhm,
I taught them to be affirming when they were young. And now the two that don't go to church generally believe that Christians, at least the majority of Christians, can't be queer affirming.
mm,
And so I sometimes feel really weird, like I believe I did the right thing to teach them what I taught them. But now they feel on the outside of the community that I've, really been trying to shape my entire life, the church.
mm.
And I like to hope that they'll find a more progressive church, but I think the stigma is still there. The word Christian to them means people who are not queer affirming, except their dad and mom.
Right. You're the minority.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I think that's important. I mean, she's starting to ask, questions about people's faith and trying to explain to her that there's different religions, which is something that's new for her.
Yeah.
Like there's
Yeah.
Christians, there's Jewish people, there's Muslim people, and there's people within those religions who believe things that are different, different. And so I said, for me, I call myself a Christian. I said, but I'm a specific kind of Christian, so trying to explain to her now there's all these different paths within Christianity that you can take. So I'm hoping to ingrain in her whatever faith she lands in as she grows, just to understand what I didn't understand when I was growing up, that there's more than one way to believe about things within that system that you find yourself falling into, because I want her to be able to understand that there's lots of different ways to think about God and Jesus if she falls in the Christianity realm, than a lot of people would tell you. And I'll tell her too that there's, people who you'll meet in school, maybe even friends' houses you'll go over to, hear parents talking, and they might say there's only one way to believe things. There's only one way. And I said, they might
Yeah.
even try to scare you. I said, no, because we've talked about hell and things like that. And they might try to tell you you've got to believe this one way or you're going to go to hell. I said, but just know that not everybody believes that. That's not the only way to believe. If you believe that someday, that's fine. I'll support you and I'll be right there with you. I said, but, that's not necessarily the truth. And
Yeah.
so those are little seeds I'm trying to drop in her 7-year-old mind as she grows.
Well, and that's one of the chapters in our book, God After Deconstruction, that we address is
Yeah,
the religious pluralism issues. And your daughter and my daughters, um, especially yours because she's younger, but it seems like every generation has more and more access to religious diversity,
that's
either
right.
through the internet or through friendships or because of the migration kind of lifestyle that most, at least in North America, have.
Yeah,
And, I remember singing as a little boy how Jesus, was the only way, and the Muslims were stupid, and the Buddhists and the Hare Krishnas were really dumb.
yeah.
um, and now I've had to rethink all of that. And in the book, we try to propose a way in which we can affirm wisdoms in multiple religious traditions and yet also justify my attraction to Jesus. And while I still try to follow him while learning from other traditions and not thinking they're all going to hell in a handbasket.
That's right. Well, that was actually gonna be my next question for you.
Oh, good.
I think it's chapter 9, I think is that. I think
Okay.
it's called Many Religions or something like that. But the verse in there that you guys, really take apart and go after is John 14:6,
I
where
think
Jesus says,
so.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And growing up, that was always a verse of exclusion, right? It's
Yes.
all about you got to go on through this little narrow gate and everybody else is on the wide road to hell. But I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what you do with that verse nowadays. Maybe share a little bit about what you don't have to give away all the pearls of wisdom from the chapter, but just kind of give people a teaser about that verse. And then also a little bit about and maybe a little bit deeper about your own journey and kind of opening up to other faiths.
Yeah, I think as a young evangelist, I thought that the biblical passage that says that no one comes to the Father except through me meant that every person who could find salvation had to have some kind of knowledge of this Jesus of Nazareth and probably pray a sinner's prayer or
Hmm.
some kind of give my heart to Jesus or confess my sins or something
Yeah.
like that. But if you actually look at the Bible, there's lots of people who find salvation who never do those kinds of things.
Right.
And so we try to argue that this idea that coming to God through Jesus means the ways of Jesus, and the ways
Hmm.
of Jesus are the ways of love. And we think that love is at the heart of salvation, no matter the tradition. Jesus exemplifies that. God is a God of love. And I happen to think God inspires love in everyone, including atheists.
Hmm.
So we can affirm that verse, but understand it in terms of coming to God through the ways of love as expressed through Jesus.
Mm.
And that, it seems to me, fits the general drift of Scripture without becoming this exclusivistic kind of push. And
Mm.
then we immediately follow that passage by looking at Paul's conversation with the Athenians, the famous the God in whom we live and move and have our being. And the part of that story in which he's talking to these philosophers in Athens, and he talks about, they're worshiping an unknown God and all that. The
Mhm.
part of that story I like the most, Glenn, is when Paul says something like, if you feel about for this God, you might grasp him. That
Mm.
idea of feeling about is a way to speak about our deep intuitions for beauty, truth, love, goodness, which I think are all found in God.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a part of the Christian tradition to feel about for those virtues.
Yeah. Yeah, I think again, back when I was younger, it was all, if you weren't a Christian, you were on the road to hell, and there was nothing that any other religion had to offer
No.
that I couldn't find within Christianity. So all those other religions, everything was meaningless and was pointless. But again, going back to Apple, another big thing was, I was working with people who were from these various religious backgrounds, and some
Yeah.
of them were even agnostic and atheist, and people who grew up as Christians, but they made their decisions to go in a different way. And again, coming into relationship with these people and hearing their stories helped me have a much deeper appreciation for, where they were coming from. So like you, I started to see that verse as more, you know, following the way of Jesus, and the way of Jesus is a way of love. It's a way of
Mm.
grace. It's a way of peace. And
Yeah.
I began to realize that there are other people in other religions, even people who are atheists, who are following ways of love and ways of peace. And so, what if, to go along with the podcast, like, what
Yeah.
if they're really following in this way, and they're on the same path to the Father, so to speak, that I'm on, because they're
Right.
following in the same way. And so, I remember another big moment for me was when I read Barbara Brown Taylor's book, Holy Envy. And she
Uh,
talks in that book about how she was a professor of religion at a university, and she had to teach her class all these different religions that she didn't really know much about. And so she had to do her own research, and she took them to, Hindu temples, and she took them to all these different places to meet all these different people. And she's like, all of a sudden I began to have this holy envy of these things I encountered in these other religions. But I
mm,
never wanted to convert to those religions. I never wanted to leave Christianity to go to Hinduism or, Islam or something like that. But she said there were things that I learned in those religions that I felt like made me a better follower of Jesus. And
mm,
so she makes this one comment that she has these different like tents set up in various religious villages, but she always comes home to Jesus at night. Like that's her place where she goes and she finds her
that's
rest.
nice.
And
Yeah.
I feel like that's made a lot of sense to me because I've had so many people on the podcast, especially who have these different backgrounds that are just majorly different than mine. And they might have different beliefs and things like that that maybe don't really know if I align with or I agree with, but there's things that they're doing in their own spiritual journey that I'm like, oh man, like I want that for my own journey. So I've like adopted some different things to fit into my own Christian journey that have come from other religions. And so
That's
my
beautiful.
deconstruction journey has just led me to a place where I have a much deeper appreciation for the stories and the traditions of other people.
That's awesome. I think for me, it's probably my engagement with Mormons that is, when I was younger, I knew no Jews, Buddhists. I was from a little farming town in eastern Washington.
Right.
Um, but there were the Mormons, and we thought the Mormons were, couldn't be Christians. And so I got my Bible and tried to prove that Mormonism was wrong. And, they had becoming gods was, et cetera, all this sort of stuff. But as I got older, I had this kind of a litmus test,
Mm,
and the litmus test was this: who do I want to be my neighbor? Like, who do I
mm,
want to actually live next to me? And I'd
yeah.
rather have, if I had just generically picked people out, I'd rather have a Mormon than a Southern Baptist living next to me.
Yeah. Right.
If I just picking at random, the odds are that the Mormon's going to be a better neighbor than most Southern Baptists I know.
Right. Right.
And I thought, okay, well, if that's the way it works in the world, if people who are loving are Mormons are more likely to be loving, I can't dismiss that religion, even if there are
Yeah.
some things I can't buy into.
Yeah.
So that's helped me.
Yeah. One last question for you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the topic of religious trauma. That's another section that you have
Yeah,
you address in the book, because one of the pieces of pushback I've gotten from people, and I know a lot of our listeners have gotten it as well, is that you weren't traumatized in the church. Unless you had some big, experience, where you were, God forbid, molested or something like that by, by a leader or something like that. That's one thing. But, the majority of people who are just sitting in the pews every Sunday, there's no trauma that's there. But as I've been deconstructing and rethinking my own journey, I'm like, yeah, there really is an aspect of trauma there that I feel like even today brings about a full body response. Because, like, for instance, when I was in sixth grade, we went through the book of Revelation in my private Christian school, very light reading for a sixth grader going through the book of Revelation. And we were watching A Thief in the Night, which is that 70s movie,
sure.
and all about the rapture, and you're going to be left behind. You got to believe all the right things. You got to evangelize people to make sure they're not left behind. And as a kid, like I mean, I was in sixth grade, and I'm like my nervous system's still developing, like my brain's still developing, like everything is in full blown development, but I'm getting these messages of fear that are coming to me. And like Tom, I literally would have nightmares at night. Like I would wake up
Hmm.
crying, and I would never tell my parents because I was so afraid that if I told them, they would tell me that they believed all the right things
Hmm.
just to calm me down, and then I would be a failed evangelist, and they would end up going to hell anyway because they didn't really believe the right things. So, like, I
Yep.
lived with that for the longest time, and hearing about, like, there's gonna be rumors of war, and there's gonna be fires and storms, all these things are the precursors for the end times. So, like, now I don't believe those things at all. But I'm still finding that when I hear things on the news, like about wars, I hear things on the news that are, that's going on with Israel and Palestine, all the talk about, like the temple eventually being rebuilt, like all those different kind of things, and like, the different storms that we're having, and like the fire that was in Australia, the fires that were in Canada. Like I still have that nervous system response
Yep.
still comes back to me, and I can feel my heart start to race. I can feel myself start to sweat. Like all those different things still come back. So my question is, for people who are listening who have experienced a similar type of trauma, so to speak, what does deconstruction look like? Is it possible to have not just like an intellectual deconstruction, but a full body deconstruction where you take that deconstruction into your nervous system as well to find some healing from the stuff that you've been given? Because, like, I think about my life, I'm like, that's not normal. That's not normal to
Right.
hear about something like that and have that initial fear. Like, my initial reaction is fear. And I have to
Yep.
quiet that Christian soldier inside that, no, 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 we don't believe that way. And we don't think that way. Like, those things that you were handed were not the best teaching. It's like I have to literally talk myself off the ledge sometimes. So I'm just wondering if you have anything to speak into that kind of situation, if people might align or feel a similar way.
Yeah, I do have things to say about that. First of all, before I answer your trauma question,
Mhm.
let me say that I think for many people on their deconstruction journey, moving towards some kind of health, healing, and wholeness, the a major part of that is giving up belief in hell.
Mhm.
Once you do that, I think that's a crucial step toward overcoming some of the other things that you've mentioned.
Yep.
And I think that's oftentimes an intellectual journey. And so your head can be giving up on hell, but you still have you're conditioned to have these negative reactions when
Yep.
I don't know, like an illustration of my own family. My wife doesn't believe in hell, but every New Year's Eve, she was told that as a young child, Jesus was coming back on New Year's Day, and she still has this visceral feeling on New Year's Eve,
Yep.
and what am I ready or whatever.
Yep.
Um, I think the sad news I think I have to share is that the road toward reorienting
Mhm.
ourselves after that kind of trauma is a long road.
Yep.
When you're conditioned to feel certain things because of what you've been taught in the past, it takes a while to recondition your body
That's right.
and your mind. Um, and here, actually, this is where being a part of a positive community, a positive church, or some other kind of group of people, and pursuing habits of prayer, meditation, hiking, whatever it is, those spiritual disciplines actually matter
Mhm.
even after deconstruction,
Yep.
because in what you're doing is you're kind of reprogramming yourself. You're overcoming the crap, the conditioning that you've been given in your past, and it takes real bodily practices. It takes being in positive communities. It takes reading good books and listening to better ideas than what you've been given.
Mhm.
It takes some work, but I think there is the possibility to, if not entirely overcome that trauma, at least overcome most of it because of the work you do.
Yeah. That's really good. I think one of the things that I found most helpful is learning is like meditation has helped me to bring myself into the present moment. Because I feel
Mhm.
like a lot of Christianity growing up was all about some other moment, right? It was all about
Ah,
the moment I'm gonna die and I'm gonna be faced at the pearly gates. It's the moment when
yeah.
Jesus is gonna come back. It's all about preparing for this future moment. And I feel like
Uh,
that conditioned me, so to speak, to always be thinking in advance, always be thinking
yeah.
about what's down the road, what's over there, never really here. And so doing a
Huh.
lot of like breath work to, you know, take those deep breaths and to ground myself in the moment, as silly as it might sound, to let my let myself feel that my feet, are on the ground. Like though all those
That's
things
not
have helped
silly at
me,
all.
yeah, have helped me kind of bring myself when I feel those initial reactions and my nervous system goes into overdrive. I've I've come to recognize that much more quick than I used to. And so now as
Mhm.
soon as I recognize it, I have to tell myself, all right, just take a breath, take some deep breaths, whether it's for a minute, 5 minutes, whatever it might be, and just kind of ground myself in this moment. Then I can speak more clearly to myself. I can remind myself of these new things that I've learned. I no longer believe in hell. I no longer believe in a rapture. I no longer believe that the Bible is teaching these different things or this is the purpose of the Bible. And kind of go through these faith affirmations, I guess you could say, of what I've learned in my deconstruction, and all of a sudden I can feel myself start to settle a little bit. So to your point, like I don't think, Rome wasn't built in a day, they say, right? Like
Yep.
I didn't get to this point in a day. I'm 42 years old. Like this is a lifetime of things I've been conditioned to believe. It's not going to go away overnight. It might never go away, but I think that the important thing is that we come to recognize quicker and quicker and quicker when we feel our nervous system go out of whack, and we can then ground ourselves in the moment. So
I'm with you 100%. And let me add one thing.
sure.
Um, I think it's really important to do this work on ourselves and to seek this kind of healing. Um, but also, I think it's good to feel good that you're not passing that crap on to your daughter.
Mhm.
Like, you're not the perfect parent. None of us are.
Mm.
but at least you're not teaching your daughter about hell or the rapture.
Right. Doing something right. I wanna go one notch in my belt.
Yes. And so, part of our mission is to do our own self-care, but also to care for others, and that's key, I think, when you're a parent.
Yeah. And it's funny, like, going back to the parent thing, like, I remember a couple weeks ago, we were laying in bed, I was putting Jordan to bed, and we said our prayers and things, and she said to me, she said, "Daddy, is there a hell?" And I was like, I had this, like, long pause, and I said to her, I was like, "What do you think?" I spun it back to her. And she said, "Well, I don't think so." And I said, "Why don't you think so?" And she said, "Well, because, Jesus and is so loving and so kind, and so I think that God is so loving and so kind, and how could such a horrible place exist if that's who God really is?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "That makes a lot of sense to me." And she said, "Well, did you like ever believe in hell?" Because she knows a little bit of my former story. So I said, "I did." I said, "I used to believe in hell a lot. I would tell people all about hell. I would tell people that they were going there if they didn't believe the right things." I said, "But you know what the really cool thing is?" I said, "Is that you can always change your mind." I said, "Because you learn new things as you grow." And I said, all of a
Mm,
sudden, the things that I was learning when I was growing, those beliefs I used to have didn't really make any sense anymore. And so I said, I had a
mm.
choice where I could either keep believing the same thing, or I could start to rethink what I was thinking based upon my experiences and come to a different conclusion. I said, "So I agree with you. I don't think there's a hell." And she said, "Oh, okay, that makes me feel better." And then she went to sleep. But I just think it's so interesting to have those conversations with her because I never had that. I think
Yeah.
my parents probably would have had those conversations with me had I brought those things up that I was scared to talk to them about because of what I said before. But like the teachers and the pastors and things like that, those conversations never, ever, ever would have happened. And so to your point, thank you for that affirmation. I am trying to have those kind of conversations with her so that she can have a bigger and a wider faith.
Yeah, and I think you should feel free to present to her the best, most loving vision of God you know how to present,
Mm.
all the while knowing you're probably going to get something wrong. And that will probably allow you to give your own parents a little more grace because, you're not the perfect parent and you didn't have the perfect parents.
Yep.
But I'm against what some people do. Some people say, "Well, I want my kids to choose their own religion, so I'm not going to influence them in any way possible." I
Hmm.
think that's the wrong move. I
Mm.
think you ought to influence them in the ways you think is best, all the while knowing that they're going to end up making up their own mind, and you need to be fine with that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. Tom, thank you for your time, my friend. We're just about out of time, but this has been a lot of
Thank you.
fun. I always have fun with you. Appreciate
I
you.
enjoy it. I appreciate you, Glenn.
And real quick, is there any place where people can go to interact more with this particular work or anything else you want to point us to?
Well, there was a class called God After Deconstruction,
Hmm.
and Tripp Fuller and I did some videos pertaining to each chapter, and you can find that using the QR code at the end of the chapters. But you can find the book in audio, ebook, print, hardback, wherever good books are sold.
That's right. Excellent. All right, Tom. Well, I'll put links in the show notes and we'll do it again soon.
All right, great.